Gaza War Day 355, Lebanon War Day 8. We will count them separately while they continue. Um, an interesting note from Elijah Magnier. I think he's French, so it's probably Magnier. French kind of veteran reporter. He's got a newsletter. I've talked about him before. He's frequently takes interviews on the web, and he's got a big Twitter account. And he said something interesting um, today on Twitter. I mean, I recommend his Twitter actually. But he said on the first day, Israel bombed 2,000 Hezbollah targets, and on the second day, 60? Is that it? Hezbollah believed that Israel had 13,000 to 15,000 targets to bomb. If Israel is finished, if you, Israel, are finished, you are in deep shit. Excuse Elijah's language. But I think his point is an interesting one. What he's pointing out is that there was a lot more airstrikes yesterday than there were today. And that's not, let's just say it's a break in the pattern. So the war's been going for 8 days. So we can recap again. It's probably worth recapping. I count day one as the pager attack, the terrorist attack on thousands of pagers, blowing up thousands of pagers. Day two, the attack on the funerals of the people who were killed in the pager attack through walkie-talkies. Day three, Nasrallah made his speech to say we are not destroyed by these attacks, these terrorist attacks, and we continue to have the ability to confront whatever. He was confident. And then day four, the assassinations of the highest level commanders of the Red One force, is Lebanon's Hezbollah's special forces unit and the founding commanders, Akil and Wahebe of that force. So those are the first 4 days. Then it was another 2 days of bombing by Israel, and then rockets by Hezbollah, rockets on Rafah, Ramat David, Rafael facility. Israel, on I think it was day 6, they said they targeted the third in command of Hezbollah, but they didn't get him. And they killed 500 people a couple of days ago. And today, the martyrs, they counted 70 killed and 400 wounded. Now, the pattern up until now was Israel's doing more and more and more and more. Now, maybe they're getting their ducks in a row for a ground invasion. It does certainly appear that way. They are talking about calling up recruits, reserves. They're moving more and more troops to the north. They're moving tanks to the north. People say that's a bluff. I don't think it's a bluff. I don't think there's a lot of bluffing happening here. This is not a time of bluffing anymore. This is a time of people doing what they said they were going to do. Israel hasn't, we've talked a lot about how Hezbollah doesn't bluff and Nasrallah doesn't bluff, but Israel hasn't been bluffing either. Israel has talked about going and slaughtering the people of Gaza, women, children, animals, Amalek, treating them like Amalek, and then they did it. They said they were going to kill civilians in Lebanon, and then they did it. There's a little bit of coded messaging in the sense of we're going to, we think there's terrorists in the hospital. That's just another way of signaling that they're going to murder people in the hospital. And they said there's missiles under people's beds, so they're going to blow up their beds, whatever. That's what they're doing in Lebanon. They said they were going to cut the power, they did. They said they were going to cut the water, they did. They said they were going to cut all food, and they did. Israel's not bluffing. This is not bluff. This is not a time of bluff. And I don't think Israel's bluffing in about invading Lebanon. And maybe they know something we don't, but it is if they don't know something we don't, if we know and we're judging by their performance in Gaza, and the additional armament and training and supply lines that Hezbollah has relative to Hamas in Gaza and the other armed factions in Gaza, um, the invasion is not going to go well, and it may not last long, or it may become another quagmire because they don't have a way to not invade. I know that sounds strange, but this is why I thought it was going to happen in the summer, because they're not analyzable in rational terms. Rational terms means they could have stopped the war anytime. They could stop the war today by ending the war in Gaza. No more Yemeni missiles, no more Yemen blockade, no more rockets from Lebanon, nothing. Unilateral ceasefires from everybody. If they stop invading, if they stop the aggression on Gaza, they get all the hostages that they haven't managed to kill yet back, that the Israelis haven't killed themselves through bombardment. They get them all back. That's rational. Um, this is something else. This is a different logic. Now, let's not underestimate within their belief system what they could be thinking. We could analyze. There's always some kind of rationality. It's just a question of assumptions. Um, Now, assumptions include that the West is going to continue to backstop them, that the Americans are going to they provided munitions, they provided fuel, they provided supplies, everything. And maybe that means they'll provide troops too. Will they provide troops? They say the airborne division, one of the American airborne divisions, the 101st, that always the vanguard of American fighting units, is in Cyprus, ready to go. Um, so maybe we will see Americans fighting alongside the Israelis in Lebanon. Maybe we'll see them participating directly in the genocide. I don't know. I don't know what I don't think we can assume there's any internal stopping point, any internal red line for the US, in terms of nothing that they would be asked to do in moral terms would stop them. It will cause the US establishment and military and press and academic administrations all the way across the board to reconsider. They have been doing a genocide for a year. Nobody has batted an eye. We can no longer assume they won't participate directly in a ground war or a ground genocide. Now, Iran. We should talk a bit about Iran. People have been saying that Iran has been making some missteps. Pezeshkian has been more conciliatory than he should be, and they're projecting weakness on the world stage. I think a lot of normal things are being interpreted as weakness from Iran. I think the Ayatollah Khamenei spoke today, and I think he did a lot to try to dispel the notion that Iran had any intention of abandoning Hezbollah. He talked pretty tough about Israel and about the need for Muslims to return Israel to its rightful owners. I mean, to return Palestine to its rightful owners and Al-Aqsa to its rightful owners. The need for, the fact that Iran stood with Palestine to the end. Um, all of those things. The Ayatollah gave a very strong speech. I think the point of the speech was basically like, don't think that Iran has any intention of abandoning the axis of resistance or its role in the axis of resistance. So I think all of this, what I want to kind of address through tonight's video is just this notion that I think it's one of the propaganda narratives that you have to watch for and be vigilant of, which is like, now that the war has started, now that Israel is preparing to invade Lebanon and is pounding Lebanon, there's going to be a narrative story that the resistance and Hezbollah are paper tigers, that they're all talk. You've probably started to see this, that Iran really secretly wants to make a deal with the US, that they can be broken up, that Hezbollah has become toxic to Iran. I've seen that somewhere. I don't know exactly how that works. Um, now that is Iran is now that Israel is destroying southern Lebanon, that the people of Lebanon are going to turn on Hezbollah. They're going to try to surrender. Um, and that story is, I think that's the pro-Israel propaganda story of this moment. So there's a different pro-Israel story for each audience, and there's a different pro-Israel story for each moment. For a long time, up until the war started, there's also the story of Syria being a dictatorship. Um, that's just a propaganda term. Dictators are just leaders that the West doesn't like, of being a huge human rights violator. That's also basically a propaganda term and a propaganda concept. Um, Nobody in the West cares about human rights. They're sponsoring a genocide. Human rights is not something that is a real thing that anybody in the West cares about. Um, how can you care about human rights if you're literally sponsoring a genocide? It's just preposterous that we have to even talk about this. But the idea that Syria is equivalent, so there's a whole thing, like Mehdi Hassan was bullying Jill Stein and Butch Ware, and he said, if you condemn Netanyahu, why don't you condemn Putin? And so it's like, so here's something happening in the world, and here's this other totally different thing happening in a totally different part of the world. So if you're against this, why aren't you against that? It's not the same. It's not the same, despite the, smooth brained thinking of the likes of Mehdi Hassan. It's not the same. They're not the same things. They're different things. And so you have to analyze them and understand them differently. Um, if Yeah, you can't just project what Israel is doing on every other country and every other conflict in the world. That's not um, that's not being analytically rigorous. It's not being true to what's actually going on in Gaza. It's a disservice to those victims to do that. I've heard many times the pro-Israel people say that about the Nazi Holocaust, the previous Nazi Holocaust, um, as opposed to this one that's happening now. But the previous Nazi Holocaust, when German Nazis and Ukrainians and others uh, massacred Jewish Europeans from Germany and Poland and Ukraine and Russia, when they were massacring Jewish and Gypsy and communists, Roma, sorry for using the term Gypsy, but they and homosexuals, which was what they called them at the time. Today we would call them LGBTQ. They massacred all of these millions of people, and that was the Nazi Holocaust. And people said, you shouldn't compare. Usually it was Zionists who said you shouldn't compare this Holocaust to other things. It's a disservice to the victims of this Holocaust. And I think that's true too now. You know, I understand the human mind searches for comparisons, but not all things are the same. Everything is not the same as everything else. And this is a unique genocidal campaign in a lot of ways. And it's important not to minimize that or try to say that it's, that Israel's enemies are no different, Israel's enemies are no better, or that the West's enemies are no different. They are different. The West is different. What Israel is doing is different. It is quite unique in terms of what's happening right now. in terms of the proportion of children being murdered, in terms of the targeting of hospitals, in terms of the targeting of shelters and safe zones, in terms of the actual effective cutting off of supplies of water, electricity, and food, in terms of the genocidal nature of the warfare, the caliber of the weapons used on civilians. All of these things are unique. You can't compare them. If you're saying that that Russia is doing these same things in Ukraine, you're not, you don't understand what's going on in Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, Palestine. If you think that Assad Assad did all of these same things to the Syrian people during the Syrian civil war, you did not actually understand what happened during the Syrian civil war or what's happening now, or both. Um, Situations can be bad, civilians can be killed, situations can be horrible. Civil wars are horrible. Um, the Russia-Ukraine war is horrible, but it doesn't have to be the Israeli genocide of Palestinians and now Lebanese because it's horrible. That doesn't make it exactly the same as everything else. I've gone on too long on this point, but it is a propaganda point that we saw up until now. And now the propaganda point that we're seeing is that the resistance is a paper tiger. The resistance is all talk. And now the resistance has been cowed by these 6, 7 days of Israeli bombardment. And Israel did have success with the terrorist attacks, the pager attack, the radio attack, and the assassination. They did somehow get Hezbollah's number. They managed to kill a lot of their commanders. They had some kind of intelligence coup that enabled them to do that. But those intelligence victories that enabled them to do these terrorism and these assassinations seem they were happening in the first 4, 5 days, and then now they don't seem to have happened in days 6, 7, 8, whatever that means. Maybe they have surprises to come, or maybe they front loaded all of their best shock weapons, which is how they play the game. Their bias is to hit really hard at the beginning. They're trying to subjugate Lebanon. They're trying to shock. They're trying to create a shock, right? This is like a Western military theory. Um, I don't know if people know about this, but like it's kind of combining like Silicon Valley hype with military thinking, such as Western military thinking. So there was like some military theorist. I read it too. I read it more than 10 years ago. I think it was John Robb, Brave New War, something like that. And so the idea was there was going to be there. This is we're on the fifth generation of warfare. Okay. So first generation is like Napoleonics, massed numbers of men, shooting each other with cannons and bayonets. And then second generation is like World War One, machine guns and trenches and lines, firepower, and that's attrition. Third generation is like the Blitzkrieg, the Nazis punching a hole through the line, going straight for the capital, taking over the capital, winning the war in a big, quick, fast move. Fourth generation warfare is basically US counterinsurgency. I don't know how that could be a model for anything because um, fourth generation wars seem to last for decades and then end with the US withdrawing. Like Afghanistan, that was, I guess, a fourth generation war. Iraq was a fourth generation war. Vietnam is considered a fourth generation war. So you kill millions of people, torture them, and then you withdraw from their country. That's a fourth generation war. But that's like considered like a, state versus non-state. That's fourth generation. And then fifth generation is like cyber attacks, information manipulation, narrative, influence operations occurs everywhere at the same time. And that's what Israel's doing, right? They're doing fifth generation warfare. So it's like that supply chain attack on Lebanon. That's like a great example of fifth generation warfare. The thing is, there's not generations. We're, Russia, Ukraine has elements of second generation warfare, right? They have trenches, they have attrition, they have like firepower. Um, there's elements of second generation warfare going on in the war between Israel and Hezbollah right now, even in the war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So the fourth generation, it's like all these generations coincide. That's why the generational concept is not a really useful concept for analyzing these things and differentiating between them. I mean, there's definitely, I've made this classification before. There's counterinsurgency, and I made three. I kind of said there's counterinsurgency warfare and genocidal warfare, and uh, and then Westphalian or Clausewitzian warfare. So this hype of five generation warfare, I think Israel's caught in that. And by Israel, I mean Israel and the US and the whole West. And they have this fascination with all this stuff that they managed to do, all these people they managed to assassinate and using pagers, and then the assassinations on day 4 of Akil and Wahebe, and then all the bombardment that they did. But then now we're on day 8, and where do they go from here? They're going to have to invade Lebanon, and they're going to have to face Hezbollah's ground troops. And they assassinated some commanders, but does that mean that Hezbollah's ground forces are in disarray? I read somewhere on Twitter that Israel's perfecting some weapon system to defeat Hezbollah's anti-tank guided missiles. I mean, I don't know. That sounds to me like a lot of the weapons, like the javelins, the ATACMs, the HIMARS, the F-16s, the Abrams tanks, all of these weapons that were going to turn the tide in Ukraine against Russia, and they haven't. And so I don't see how this system, this anti-tank system, remember the anti-tank guided missile system that Hezbollah has been using to such effect against Israel on the border, is a reverse engineered Israeli system in the first place. And by Israeli system, I mean American system, because Israel doesn't have independent. It just has labeled. It has different labels for American weapons, right? So five generation warfare does not seem, it seems to have, I mean, this is what happens, right? It's a big flash. Same with the Nazi blitzkrieg. When they faced the Soviet Union was shocked. They were certainly shocked. They were certainly devastated. They lost tens of millions of people. Their whole country was destroyed. But they absorbed all of that shock, and then they counterattacked. And Ali Mortada, who makes the "Hello My Enemies" videos, he made a "Hello My Enemies" video, and I was waiting for that. And he made it. The one I saw was from today, and he just he didn't say anything. He was watching, various bombings in the distance, and then he said, "Now it's our turn." And I think that when Israel was the first one to attack, and they rolled out this 4, 5, 6 day plan, 6 day war, right? they rolled out this 6-day plan, they they always have an advantage. If you choose the time of attack, you choose the place, you choose all the targets, you go when you're ready, not when they're ready. The resistance always takes longer to get going. Guerrilla forces have to learn how to fight on the job. Guerrilla forces take many more casualties than their opponents. It's always the case. And this is um this is a situation where Hezbollah is going to get stronger over the course of the war, not weaker. It's not because that's the nature of learning during a war as a guerrilla army. They have to learn what works. They have to learn like the hard way. People die uh, learning things, learning which systems work and how to use them, which systems don't work and how to discard them, which doctrines work. They have to develop those and watch them as they go. They've trained, they've prepared, but the experience they have is from 2006. And this is going to be different. Israel's going to be different. Maybe the Americans are coming. They've also fought. The Americans have occupied Lebanon before as well. So, so all of which is to say, beware the notion that the resistance is a paper tiger. It's absolutely not a paper tiger. And it doesn't behoove us to be smug. These wars are hellish. Israel targets the population. The population of Lebanon has already suffered immensely from this, and they're going to suffer while this war goes on. And to that end, I should mention there was a very heartbreaking video sent by some people. Various people in Gaza made these individualized videos, and they were saying things like, we're ashamed that Lebanon is suffering for us. Um, another one of the people in Gaza said, we've been complaining that Israel, that the Arab world hasn't supported us. But if we knew that this was what was going to happen to Lebanon, we wouldn't have wanted them to support us. And that's, like the idea that they're ashamed. Like, can you imagine? I wrote on Twitter, like, can you imagine our shame, like in the West, where we can't even stop our countries from openly supporting the genocide and people in Gaza who are actually suffering the genocide are sharing, you know, with the people of Lebanon who very much like knew the cost of resistance and knew the price, but like they also know Israel is their neighbor. They know Israel isn't going to stop at Gaza or Palestine. They know that they're in Israel's crosshairs and always have been. So um, there's nothing for them to be ashamed of. Uh, for us, it's a different story, I'd say. Um, Now, one other point about this paper tiger issue, because Hezbollah, like back in 2012, I believe, when Hezbollah completed various of their missile programs, Nasrallah gave a speech where he said, Israel needs to understand that it's not going to be like 2006 anymore. If Israel targets our infrastructure, we're going to target their infrastructure. And he kind of like did this hand wiping gesture where he was like, we can target their water plants, we can target their electricity plants, we can target their military bases. And he was going through and he was like, and they know, and they did that, right? They showed that hoopoe bird footage, the hudhud footage that their drone took, showing all the things they could target, and they have been targeting those in the past 3-4 days now. The thing is, they have been very systematic about hitting military targets. Not 100%. They've hit some civilian areas. A lot of the damage, I suspect, like everything that's been happening in this war, is probably from wayward Iron Dome and other Israeli anti-missile defense landings. But they have been, so they're targeting military bases, air bases, still. Mossad base. They tried to hit the Mossad base today with a Qader 1, a big missile with a 700 to 1,000 kilo payload, several ton missile, ballistic missile, which can maneuver. I don't know if it hit. Maybe it did hit Mossad headquarters. They're saying it was intercepted, but maybe it wasn't. So, but Nasrallah said, so it's going to be a civilian for a civilian. It's going to be infrastructure for infrastructure. But that Hezbollah hasn't fought that way. And I don't really think it's because they're afraid of reprisal. A lot of people say like they don't want to hit civilians because they're afraid of reprisal. They're afraid Israel's going to go crazy. Israel's crazy. Israel can't go. I don't think Israel can go much more crazy. Like, okay, the nuclear option, but like, um, you know, that sure, like we could all end the world. And I think you're right. The resistance doesn't want to end the world. Okay. But like targeting civilians in response to Israel targeting civilians, I don't know that that's going to make Israel. I don't think that's the calculation. Why? What do I think the calculation is? I could be wrong. You can tell me I'm wrong. But I think the calculation is simply that Hezbollah is doing operations that they believe will lead to winning the war. Now, Israel is also. So Israel's belief is when you terrorize civilians to a certain threshold, they'll turn. There's this Western belief, right? You terrorize civilians to a certain threshold and they'll turn on their leader. You make them suffer through sanctions, they'll turn on their leaders. They have virtually no evidence that this is true, but they do it over and over and over again. They try to kill the leaders. They try to target the leaders. They try to get people to turn on their leaders. They try to overthrow. They have some success with coups, some, but not as much. It's harder and harder even to get a good coup going if you're the West. Anyway, what I think the calculation is this: on the Israeli side, terrorize civilians, and eventually victory follows, or genocide, commit genocide, and then victory will follow. The resistance calculation and Hezbollah's calculation is we are going to demilitarize northern Israel, or what the resistance calls northern occupied Palestine. To borrow a phrase, I know I warned you against comparison a couple minutes ago, but the Russians, when they attacked Ukraine, they said we're doing this for three objectives, right? Demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, and neutralization of Ukraine. So Ukraine's going to be neutral. It's not going to have a military, and Nazis aren't going to be in charge. That's Russia's claimed objectives. Now, while Ukraine has done all these things, and NATO and the West have, they've attacked. They were shelling Donetsk this whole time. Sorry, I'm getting into more Ukraine stuff, and I know some of you guys disagree, and I'm sorry about that, but here we are. The Ukraine and NATO and the US have, they've blown up the Nord Stream. They've been shelling Donetsk, and they've attacked Moscow a few times, and so they're trying to hit nuclear plants, and so there's all these things that they're doing, and Russia's basically, saying that they're focusing on destroying the Ukrainian military and like Ukraine, and it's a brutal war, and I hate this war. I really do. Like Ukraine raises all these troops and sends them to the front, and they get killed, and they're just getting killed in huge numbers. And Russians are dying in large numbers too, probably, as far as I can tell, much, much smaller than Ukrainians. But, the pro-Russian analysts, they say that Russia is demilitarizing Ukraine, and now they're in the process of demilitarizing NATO as well. They're destroying all this equipment that the West is sending, the German Panzer tanks and the Abrams tanks and the F-16s and all of these things that the West has sent to Ukraine to use against Russia. And now the Russians are destroying that equipment as well. So they're demilitarizing. And by analogy, Lebanon is being terrorized and Israel's targeting with their air force the population of Lebanon. And Hezbollah, over the past few days, has focused on demilitarizing Israel. They're methodically attacking air bases, military bases, barracks, and increasingly military industrial complex sites. So Hezbollah made that speech. Nasrallah made that speech 12 years ago where he said, we're going to destroy your infrastructure. But I think the strategic calculation now is that it's more strategic to demilitarize northern occupied Palestine, to demilitarize Israel, than it is to try to de-electrify Israel or try to terrorize, counter-terror, try to impose a balance of terror, right? So out of the blue, if it was out of the blue, here's another way to think about it. If it was out of the blue and Israel just decided to up and start bombing Lebanon, a balance of terror might make more sense. Okay, you're bombing us, we're going to bomb you. You stop, we stop. But what's going on now is Israel has been in a war for a year, committing genocide for a year. What Hezbollah wants is for them to stop the war on Gaza. What Israel is in now is a situation where 1,000 of their armored vehicles have been badly damaged. Their troops are suffering from low morale. Thousands of them have been critically injured. Probably thousands of them have been killed. They're having trouble recruiting new men for their army. People are leaving. We don't know how many. They're hiding their losses, but their businesses are going bankrupt. So there's a whole attrition process. They may be running out of Iron Dome. If you watched Electronic Intifada today, Ali Abu Nima did some math where he was showing that the Iron Dome, he was arguing that the Iron Dome is in, the Iron Dome could run out of, they could run out of missiles for the Iron Dome, right? Iron Dome missiles are expensive compared to the rockets that are being launched at them. So, uh, so after a year of attrition, the strategic calculation is a little different than if Israel had just started bombing and assassinating people out of the blue. You don't want to let all that attrition go to waste, if you want to put it that way. Why would you let all of that attrition, all of that stock that Israel has destroyed, and that has been destroyed in Israel's war? Why would you focus on terrorizing civilians when you can keep that process of loss going and perhaps even accelerate it? So I think it makes sense, despite having announced a terror strategy or like a counter-terror strategy or a counter-terror strategy, it makes sense to have switched, if that's what they've done. I don't know if that's what they've done, but assuming that's what they've done based on how it looks, it makes sense to have done that, to have made that switch. When Nasrallah made that speech, he didn't think they would be starting a war with Israel after Israel had been fighting in Gaza for a year. Who could have anticipated that? Who could have anticipated that? No, nobody anticipated that. So yeah, so it could very well be that the strategic logic of this war is Israel's trying to terrorize the Lebanese people into stopping their support for Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is trying to demilitarize Israel and play their part in demilitarizing Israel. Now, we might as well go through what that means. On day 7, So yesterday, the 24th of September, Israel hit Haifa, the Ramat David Air Base, Rafael, Kiryat Shimona, Safad. They launched 400 rockets each day, plus the Fadi 1 and Fadi 2 missiles, which are bigger, unguided rockets, but big 70, 80 kilo payload missiles. They hit the Samson base with Fadi 3 missiles. I don't even know how big the Fadi 3 missile is. Let's see if I can find it easily. I don't know that I can. But the Fadi 3 missile, never before used. Fadi 3. Do we see any write-up on it? New to the scene? No, I don't know. I haven't seen a write-up on it. Watch for it. Maybe someone will have seen that. They hit the Dado base with 50 rockets and then 40 rockets. They hit the Shayatet 13 Athlete base with drones. Today on the 25th, they hit the Mossad headquarters. Maybe they hit it. I don't know. The Israelis say they didn't. With a Qader 1, that's a big missile, 700 kilograms, 700 to 1,000 kilograms payload. That's a big missile. They hit the Hazor Dado explosives factory in Zichron with Fadi 3s. They hit Kiryat Motzkin with Fadi 1s. Their air defense, which I predict will become more effective over the course of this war, as opposed to Israel's, which is going to wear out over the course of this war. But their air defense, they claim, sent two warplanes, Israeli warplanes, to retreat. So I think we're likely to see more of those kinds of incidents. So all of that happening in Lebanon, on that front. And in terms of America, they're having naval issues, right? You've probably seen they're having trouble finding a fueler, and their fueler, they say that it ran aground. That's kind of hard to believe. How do you run aground in the open ocean? It strikes me as unlikely, but who knows? Now, if they have trouble fueling, it's going to get kind of complicated for them. If their ships have to leave and refuel somewhere, they're going to expend fuel coming back. So who knows? They still have submarines and all kinds of cargo planes, but they're having some issues with their navy, and their biggest issue is probably still the Yemen Ansar Allah and their missiles that they use to attack the navy, anti-ship ballistic missiles that they've developed just for this purpose. Now, I think it's safe to say the U.S. is not going to pull Israel back from the brink of this. They're not the kind of friend who doesn't let their friend commit self-harm or damaging self acts. They will give Israel everything it can. So when we're talking about a war of attrition, when we're talking about Hezbollah trying to demilitarize Israel, we're talking about trying to demilitarize America, which, the Russians have said the same thing. Like Ukraine ran out of war material a long time ago. Ukraine is being held up by American support, financial and weapons. Likewise, Israel will soon, if it hasn't already, run out of resources. I mean, it ran out of resources in the first few days. There have been airlifts every day, right? Every couple of days, the Americans do an airlift of weapons and everything else that the Israelis need. And of course, Turkey is feeding the Israelis, and people from all over the region are feeding the Israelis and keeping their logistics going so they can keep the genocide happening against Gaza. The question is, are there limits to what the US can provide? And the answer is yes. And they're not political, they're hard material limits to what the US can provide while this war of attrition is happening. And that is going to be the decisive factor when that starts to tell. I don't know when it's going to start to tell. Maybe it has already. or maybe it will soon, or maybe it will after a long time. There's a hesitation from various quarters about invading Lebanon. The same thing happened with Rafah. The same thing happened with invading Gaza in the first place. All of those things, both of those things happened. And for those reasons, I think an invasion of Lebanon will also happen, no matter how badly it's going to go for Israel. Okay. Um, let's run down the other fronts quickly, because Gaza, there's active fighting in Gaza, some incredible videos coming out of Gaza, but I should talk to you about, and very solemnly now, everybody please be very solemn, because this is a very important incident. It's called the Manara Incident, and Israelis reported that 3 resistance soldiers infiltrated northern Israel from an unknown location. And a platoon of Israeli soldiers engaged these 3 resistance fighters. The battle went on for some time. The resistance fighters were, in fact, wild boars, pigs, and that was the battle. It was a battle. It was a major battle that happened today. Okay. In terms of human versus human battles between the resistance and Israel, there was in Gaza, Saraya al-Quds reports destroying a vehicle in Beit Lahia, one of the northern Gaza communities that was first attacked at the beginning of this war. There's reports of bombarding Israelis in the Netzarim corridor. Major ambushes in Gaza. There was a remarkable video of an ambush on a convoy, a supply line, convoy 2 D9 bulldozers and a Merkava tank ambush on that supply line in Rafah, I believe. Typically disgusting thing that Israel did was they sent 88 bodies of people they killed to Gaza in a container. And so there's some kind of issue going on with the container, because the Palestinians don't know whether, it's some kind of attempt to introduce biological weapons or infectious diseases or whatever. 88 is also a weird number. It's one of those important numbers to white supremacists. I don't know, whatever. Who knows what kinds of messages they're sending. West Bank, abductions in Khalil. The Israelis tried to kill a doctor in Qalqilia, so typical behavior there. Palestinian Authority dismantling improvised explosive devices in Tubas and fighting in Jenin as the Israelis besiege a hospital. So the resistance is fighting at the one of the hospitals there. Now, Syria reported intercepting 13 missiles from Israel against Tartus, and the Syrian army reported repelling an attack by the Islamic State, aka the U.S. proxies in Latakia. In Iraq, the Iraqi resistance reports hitting Shtim Air Base and Sapir airstrip in the Negev desert with a drone. They said they targeted some other important target with an Arqab cruise missile and claimed a direct hit on Eilat or Rashrash with a drone. And then the last thing I'll leave you with is the Yemen, a speech, or like I guess a briefing by the Yemen Minister of Defense, General Mohammed Nasser al-Atifi, and the Chief of the General Staff, Mohammed al-Ghamari, to the Yemeni President Mahdi al-Mashat. So the message is this: we renew our pledge that our stance will remain firm on our national and regional causes, foremost among them the Palestinian cause. We reiterate our warning to enemies, especially the usurping Zionist entity and its supporters, that we will not allow anyone to overstep their bounds. Our patience has limits, but our determination will not falter. Whoever thinks they can play with fire with us is completely ignorant of our steadfastness and iron will. If they are planning to strike us, we are planning to obliterate their existence and their usurping entity. Our upcoming strikes will be fatal to them. When we speak, we act. So that, I think, is the toughest message of today. And I'll leave you with that. So hang in there. I think this war is going to go on for a while. So yeah, hang in there, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.